The first thing I heard was breathing. Not mine. Not the wind slipping through the garage vents. It was frantic, muffled, urgent breathing coming from inside my Mercedes. Late at night, in my own underground garage. The engine had just cooled when I pulled in. The concrete still held the chill of Chicago's early winter. My heels echoed sharply as I stepped out of my car, expecting silence. Instead, I heard leather shifting, a soft gasp. Then Joshua's voice, low, hurried, careless. For a second, my body went completely still. My hand hovered near the garage light switch. But I didn't flip it. I didn't need more light to understand what was happening. My husband was inside my car, and he wasn't alone. I moved closer. Each step measured. The windows were fogged from the inside. I could make out two blurred silhouettes shifting against the cream leather seats I had chosen myself. I heard a woman's breath catch, half laugh, half sigh. I didn't scream. I didn't knock on the glass. I stepped back. My phone was already in my hand before I realized I had reached for it. One swipe. One tap. The remote security system I had installed for added safety activated instantly. The locks clicked shut. A small, mechanical sound. Precise. Final. I didn't call the police. I made a different call. And at exactly 1 a.m, someone would be pounding on my front door in panic. But by then, I would already be ready. I am Anna, 35, a business consultant who specializes in restructuring companies on the brink of collapse. I fix broken systems for a living. I analyze weaknesses, identify leverage points, and act before damage becomes irreversible. I just never imagined my own marriage would require the same treatment. From the outside, Joshua and I looked stable, successful, comfortable in our 3-story townhouse on the north side of Chicago. He was a regional sales manager for a nutritional products company, charismatic, polished, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered everyone's birthday. We had a 5-year-old son who loved dinosaurs and insisted on wearing mismatched socks. We hosted holiday dinners. We posed for photos at charity galas. We posted curated family moments online. We performed stability well. But for months, something had been off. Late meetings had multiplied. His phone had become an extension of his hand. He started stepping outside to take calls. He laughed at messages he wouldn't show me. And there was Nicole, just a nutrition consultant. He had said casually the first time her name came up, "We're exploring potential collaborations." He said it too quickly, too smoothly. I remembered one dinner 6 weeks ago. I had asked, lightly, whether Nicole would be attending an upcoming company event. Joshua's jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. "You're overthinking," he had snapped. I wasn't. Back in the garage, the breathing grew more frantic. At first, they hadn't realized the doors were locked. I could hear Joshua tugging lightly at the handle. A confused laugh. Then silence. Then another pull, harder. I walked to the side wall and leaned against the cool concrete. My pulse was steady. Too steady. I had options. I could fling open the door and drag them into the fluorescent light. I could scream loud enough to wake the entire block. I could let humiliation explode. Instead, I chose documentation. The Mercedes was registered under my name. The upgraded security system, my addition after a minor break-in scare last year, allowed interior recording and remote lock control. I had never expected to use it like this. Through the app, I activated the cabin monitoring feature. I listened. At first, they thought it was a malfunction. "Did you hit something?" A woman's voice whispered. Nicole's voice. I recognized it now, light, slightly breathless, falsely sweet. Joshua muttered something about the battery. Another pull at the handle. Locked. My phone vibrated softly in my hand. Motion alerts triggered from inside the vehicle. They were no longer laughing. I scrolled through my contacts and selected my attorney. She answered on the second ring. "It's late," she said calmly. "What happened?" I kept my voice even. "I just discovered something, and I need to document it properly." There was a pause. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. Do not confront emotionally, she said. Preserve evidence. Stay composed. I almost smiled. Stay composed was my default setting. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Our son was asleep, unaware that the foundation of his parents' marriage was cracking beneath his bedroom floor. I poured a glass of water instead of wine. My phone buzzed again. Repeated failed attempts to unlock vehicle. I imagined Joshua's confidence dissolving inside that sealed cabin. The fog thickening. The realization dawning. At 12:57, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I let it ring. Then the doorbell exploded through the house. Not once. Not politely. Relentlessly. I checked the time. 1 a.m. The pounding followed, hard. Frantic fists against the front door. Anna. Tiffany's voice pierced the hallway. Open the door. I walked slowly to the entrance, smoothing my expression into something between confusion and concern. When I opened the door, my mother-in-law stood there, pale and shaking. Joshua is locked in the car, she gasped. He can't get out. I blinked, as if hearing this for the first time. Locked, I repeated softly. Behind her, through the open garage corridor, I could hear the muffled thud of someone hitting glass. I stepped aside to let her in, and for the first time that night, I understood something with absolute clarity. I was no longer the woman standing outside the car. I was the one holding the key. By morning, the house looked exactly the same. Sunlight filtered through the tall kitchen windows, landing softly on the marble island I had picked out 3 years ago. The coffee machine hummed. My son sat at the counter in dinosaur pajamas, carefully separating marshmallows from his cereal. If anyone had walked in, they would have seen a normal Chicago morning. Joshua didn't come upstairs until almost 8. He moved slower than usual. His hair was still damp from a rushed shower. There was a faint redness around his eyes, whether from lack of sleep or something else. I didn't ask. Morning, he said, too casually. Morning, I replied, sliding a plate of toast toward our son. He kissed the top of our child's head, avoiding my eyes. Our son looked up at him. Did your late meeting go good? Daddy. Joshua hesitated half a second too long. Yeah. Buddy. Long night? I watched the performance unfold in front of me. The practiced smile. The steady voice. The illusion of stability. It would have been impressive if I hadn't heard him breathing in the dark. From the outside, we were the kind of family people envied. 3 floors of clean lines and modern finishes. Matching holiday pajamas in December. Photos framed on the hallway wall. Graduations. Vacations. Anniversaries. Joshua was charming at dinner parties. He remembered names. He complimented hosts. He raised a glass and toasted to partnership. I built struggling companies back into profitability. I stepped into chaos and turned it into structure. We were a brand. And brands are carefully curated. 6 months ago, I began noticing small inconsistencies. At first, they were almost laughably minor. Joshua started guarding his phone like it contained state secrets. He took calls in the hallway. He flipped the screen face down at dinner. He laughed at messages that he never explained. When I asked casually who he was texting so much, he smiled. Clients. You know how it is. I did know how it was. That was the problem. Late client dinners became more frequent. Credit card statements reflected upscale restaurants in neighborhoods he had no accounts in. When I mentioned one charge, he waved it off. Networking, he said. You should appreciate hustle. I did appreciate hustle. I just recognized when it wasn't strategic. Nicole's name entered our house gradually. She's a nutrition consultant. Joshua told me one evening while loosening his tie. Smart. Ambitious. Good synergy potential. He said her name with an ease that felt rehearsed. At a small company event, he pointed her out across the room. She stood too close to him. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said. When I asked later how long they had been working together, his expression hardened. You're reading into nothing. Anna. That was the first time he snapped at me over something that small, And the first time I realized I wasn't imagining it. Back in the kitchen, Joshua finished his coffee quickly. "I've got an early call," he said, checking his phone. "Of course," I replied. He hesitated, as if expecting a confrontation. I gave him none. After he left, I cleared the dishes and walked upstairs to my office. My consulting firm operated almost entirely remotely. My clients were in 3 different states. Crisis was my specialty. Documentation was my reflex. I logged into our joint financial dashboard. The overnight activity alert from the bank blinked quietly at the top of the screen. Attempted transfer. Timestamp. 12:37 a.m. Amount. Substantial enough to matter. Destination account. Unfamiliar. I felt something settle into place inside me. The time overlapped almost exactly with the moment I had locked the Mercedes. While he was in my car with Nicole, someone had tried to move money. That wasn't passion. That was planning. I traced the destination account through public records and business registries. An LLC had been registered 2 months ago under Nicole's name. Joshua listed as strategic advisor. The registered address was a small office space downtown, close to where he claimed to have client meetings. The filing date made my stomach tighten. It was 1 week after Joshua convinced me to co-sign a credit extension for what he described as temporary liquidity needs. He had framed it as a smart move for our future. It appeared that future did not include me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The affair was personal betrayal. The LLC was financial betrayal. The combination was not impulsive. It was calculated. My phone buzzed with a text from Tiffany. "Is Joshua okay?" He sounded stressed last night. The wording was careful. I typed back evenly. "He came home late. What's going on?" There was a long pause before her response arrived. "He's been under a lot of pressure. Big plans. You know how ambitious he is. Big plans." The phrase echoed in my mind. I remembered a family barbecue in late summer. Tiffany had been unusually warm toward Nicole. "She's impressive," she had said casually. "Young women these days are so driven." Joshua had watched me carefully when she said that. At the time, I thought it was harmless. Now, I wondered how much Tiffany knew. My phone buzzed again, another alert. A secondary attempt to access our shared line of credit had been flagged for unusual activity. Originating IP. Not our home network. I stared at the screen. Someone inside that car hadn't just been having an affair. They had been trying to build something. Using my resources. Using my reputation. Using my silence. Downstairs, the house remained quiet. Sunlight stretched across the hallway. Our son's toys were still scattered near the couch. Everything looked stable. But stability, I knew, was often an illusion maintained by the person holding the structure together. I closed the financial dashboard and opened a blank document instead. I began listing dates, charges, transfers, names. If Joshua believed the only secret I had uncovered was his affair, he was dangerously mistaken. Last night hadn't been about catching him cheating. It had been about discovering leverage. And this morning, I finally understood something clearly. The breathing in the car was just the beginning. The money trail was the real story. Joshua left for work without touching me. He paused in the doorway like he used to, as if waiting for a kiss or a question. I gave him neither. I watched him adjust his jacket, check his phone, and step out into the cold Chicago morning. The door closed softly. I stood at the window until his car disappeared at the corner. He thought last night had been contained. Awkward. Dangerous. Maybe, but contained. He had no idea what I had saved. I walked upstairs to my office and shut the door. The house felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. My laptop was already open. The Mercedes security system synced automatically with my cloud storage. Interior monitoring had activated the moment I locked the doors. I hadn't listened to the full recording yet. Now I did. I kept the volume low. At first, it was just movement. Nervous laughter. Confusion when the locks wouldn't release. "Did you hit something?" Nicole's voice floated through the speaker. "No." It's just the system, Joshua said. Anna probably updated it again. She's obsessed with security. He laughed. I didn't. Then the tone shifted. You're sure she doesn't know? Nicole asked. Of course not, he replied quickly. She's too busy running her little consulting empire. Little. I replayed that word once, then forced myself forward. The conversation drifted away from the immediate problem of the locked doors and into something else entirely. The investor call is next week, Nicole said. We need the bridge funding before then. It's handled, Joshua replied. The credit extension cleared. We'll move it in stages. My pulse slowed. The credit extension. You're sure she won't see it? Nicole pressed. Joshua sighed. Anna doesn't check small transfers. She trusts me. I paused the recording. He was wrong. I opened the Illinois Business Registry website and typed in Nicole's full name. The LLC appeared immediately. Filed 8 weeks ago. Managing member. Nicole Harris. Strategic advisor. Joshua Bennett. Business category. Wellness consulting and nutritional optimization services. The registered address matched a shared workspace downtown. I clicked into the filing details and felt something hard settle in my chest. The formation date was 1 week after Joshua convinced me to co-sign the expanded credit line for our household liquidity. I remembered that conversation clearly. We should leverage our credit while rates are stable, he had said. It's just smart planning. I had trusted him. Now I saw the structure. I searched deeper. The LLC's website was minimal but polished. Clean fonts. Professional branding. Language that felt familiar. Too familiar. I opened one of my archived consulting decks and compared phrasing. Certain frameworks. Certain terminology. It wasn't identical. But it was mine. My phone buzzed. A message from Tiffany. Joshua mentioned you were upset about something. Is everything all right? I stared at the screen. He had already begun shaping the narrative. I typed back slowly. We'll talk soon. Then I closed the thread. I opened the financial dashboard again. The attempted transfer at 12:37 a.m. had been flagged because the amount exceeded the automatic daily threshold. It hadn't gone through. Destination account number linked to a regional bank branch I didn't recognize. I traced it. It connected to the LLC. He had tried to move money while he was in my car. I sat back and exhaled carefully. This wasn't reckless infidelity. This was coordinated planning. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. She answered on the second ring. I have documentation? I said. LLC filings. Attempted transfers. Potential intellectual property misuse? She didn't sound surprised. Email everything, she replied. Do not confront him yet. There's more, I said. The prenup. The fiduciary clause. Silence. That clause activates if shared assets are used for undisclosed ventures or if reputational damage affects your business, she said slowly. Are you suggesting both? I'm not suggesting, I replied. I'm confirming. She told me to preserve every record and avoid escalation until we were ready. When I hung up, I checked my inbox. An automated notification from the bank. Another attempted login. Originating IP address unfamiliar. I cross-referenced it. The location mapped to the shared workspace listed on the LLC registration. Nicole's office. My jaw tightened. They weren't just building something behind my back. They were actively trying to extract capital. My phone buzzed again. This time from Joshua. Lunch tonight. We should reconnect? Reconnect? The word almost made me laugh. I typed back. I'm working late. I watched the typing indicator appear, then disappear. He was recalculating. That evening, he returned home unusually attentive. He brought takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant without being asked. He sat closer than usual on the couch. You've seemed distant, he said carefully. Have I? I replied. He searched my face for anger. For accusation, I gave him calm. We should plan something, he continued. A weekend away. Just us. Maybe, I said. He hesitated. "Have you checked the joint account recently?" he asked casually. There it was. I met his eyes. "Why?" "No reason," he said quickly. "Just making sure everything's in order." "It is," I replied. He relaxed slightly, misreading the meaning. Later, after he fell asleep, I returned to my office. I drafted an email to the bank authorizing enhanced monitoring on the credit line. Then I drafted another document, one I did not send yet. A request to freeze access pending review. I set it to schedule. 48 hours from now. I opened the LLC website again and studied the investor section. There was a presentation link. Password protected. I smiled faintly. Joshua believed he was building leverage. He believed I was unaware. He believed trust was permanent. I closed my laptop and turned off the light. In the darkness, I replayed one sentence from the recording. Anna doesn't check small transfers. He was wrong about many things. But this was the most dangerous mistake of all. If they wanted to build a business behind my back, I would let them. Just long enough to collapse it from the inside. I watched the clock more closely than I watched my husband. 48 hours. Joshua moved around the house with a restless energy that would have looked like excitement to anyone who didn't know better. He checked his phone constantly. He stepped outside for calls. He smiled to himself at nothing. "Big week," he said casually Tuesday evening while loosening his tie. "Things are about to change for us." "Yes," I replied evenly. "They are." He didn't notice the double meaning. Wednesday morning arrived cold and sharp. I drove our son to school, kissed him goodbye, and returned home with deliberate calm. At 8:45, I logged into the bank portal. The scheduled authorization was waiting. Credit line freeze. Activation time, 9 a.m. I confirmed it with a single click. My attorney had already filed the supporting documentation tied to the prenup clause, misuse of shared assets and fiduciary breach. Everything time-stamped. Everything documented. At 8:59, I placed my phone face down on my desk. At 9 a.m. exactly. It vibrated. Credit access restricted. Pending review. I imagined the conference room downtown. Glass walls. Polished table. Nicole standing in front of a screen with her sleek presentation deck. Joshua seated beside her. Confident. Persuasive. I imagined the moment they attempted to demonstrate secured funding. My phone buzzed again. Transaction declined. Another buzz. Unauthorized access attempt. IP address. The shared workspace listed on the LLC filing. I picked up my phone and opened my email. An automatic alert confirmed a login attempt from the same location. A third buzz. Joshua calling. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. "What did you do?" he demanded. Voice stripped of polish. "Good morning," I said. "The credit line is frozen. The transfer failed. The bank says there's a review." "Yes," I replied calmly. There was silence on the other end. Not confusion. Recognition. "You had no right," he said finally. "It's under my name," I corrected. "I have every right." "You're sabotaging us." "No," I said. "You did that?" I could hear muffled movement in the background. Voices. A door shutting. Nicole's faint whisper. "You're overreacting." He tried again. Shifting tone. "This is just business." "Exactly," I said. "And business requires transparency." He hung up without saying goodbye. Within minutes, another email arrived, this one from his company's compliance department. Subject. Clarification request regarding external business activity. I had sent a quiet inquiry 2 days earlier, attaching documentation that suggested a potential conflict of interest. I had framed it as concern for corporate integrity, not personal grievance. Now they were responding. "We have initiated a preliminary review." I leaned back in my chair. My phone rang again. "Tiffany," I answered. "Anna, what is happening?" she demanded. Joshua said something about a bank error. "It's not an error," I said. "He said you froze funds tied to an investment." "Yes," There was a pause. I could hear the strain in her breathing. He told me the startup was for the family, she said carefully. For your future. Did you invest? I asked. Silence. Did you give him money? I repeated. A soft exhale. I loaned him some funds, she admitted. He said it was temporary. How much? Enough, she whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. Did you sign anything? I asked. Yes. Some documents Nicole prepared. Did you read them? Another silence. That was answer enough. When we hung up, a new email arrived. This one from Nicole. Anna, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Joshua told me you were supportive of this venture. I stared at the screen. Supportive? I forwarded her message to my attorney. Then I typed a brief reply. Please direct future communication through legal counsel. My phone vibrated again. Compliance department requesting a formal call. I stepped into my home office, shut the door, and connected. The voice on the other end was controlled. Professional, we've become aware of a possible external business venture involving Mr. Bennett, the compliance officer said. We need clarification regarding use of company contacts and potential misuse of shared assets. I kept my tone neutral. I'm happy to provide documentation. I attached the LLC filing, the attempted transfer logs, and a screenshot of the pitch deck summary I had accessed through a cached link. There was a long pause on the call. This will require internal review, the officer said finally. Of course, I replied. When the call ended, my phone lit up with a text from Joshua. We need to talk tonight. I read it twice. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary weekday noise. Cars passed. A delivery truck stopped at the corner. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. Inside the shared workspace downtown, I imagined the investor meeting dissolving. No secured funds. No seamless presentation. No confident projection. Just questions. At 4 p.m, another email arrived. Mr. Bennett's corporate email access has been temporarily restricted pending review. I didn't smile. I simply stood and walked downstairs. When Joshua came home that evening, his movements were sharp and unsteady. They locked me out, he said immediately. I know, I replied. You contacted them? Yes. He stared at me as if seeing someone unfamiliar. You're ruining everything, he said quietly. I held his gaze. No, I said. I'm protecting what's mine. For the first time since the garage. His confidence faltered. He had built something in secret. He had assumed I would discover it too late. What he never understood was this. I didn't need to shout to collapse his plans. All I had to do was make one call and press one button. Joshua didn't slam the door when he came home that night. He closed it carefully, almost politely, as if the house itself might react to his anger. His jaw was tight. His tie was loosened but still hanging around his neck like he hadn't decided whether he was staying or leaving. We need to talk, he said. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, spreadsheets glowing calmly in front of me. I didn't look surprised. Of course, I replied. Our son was upstairs with a cartoon playing softly in his room. I had made sure of that. Joshua pulled out the chair across from me and sat down hard. What did you tell them? He demanded. The truth, I said. You went to compliance. You froze the credit line. You contacted the bank. Yes. You had no right to sabotage a business opportunity. It wasn't your business. I corrected. It was ours. Or at least it involved our assets. He ran a hand through his hair. Pacing now instead of sitting. It was an investment, he said. A smart one. Nicole and I saw an opportunity. Nicole and I, not we. Not our family. You saw a shortcut, I replied quietly. He stopped pacing and stared at me. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, he said. My sales numbers have been flat. They're restructuring territories. I needed something bigger. So you built it in secret, I said, using my credit, my professional frameworks, my name. His expression flickered. What are you talking about? I reviewed the pitch deck, I said calmly. You used language pulled from my consulting materials. He looked genuinely startled. How did you even... The security system records more than you realize. I interrupted. Silence dropped between us. You recorded us? He asked, incredulous. I documented what happened in my vehicle, I said. Yes. His face shifted from anger to something closer to fear. This is insane, he said. You're turning a private issue into a legal war. You made it legal when you attempted to transfer funds at 12:37 a.m., I said evenly. His shoulders stiffened. That was timing, he muttered. No, I replied. That was planning. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and swore under his breath. What now? I asked. Nicole's freaking out, he said. Investors are asking questions. Good, I said. He looked up sharply. You think this is funny? No, I said. I think it's predictable. He dropped into the chair again, this time leaning forward. You don't get it, he said, lowering his voice. We were going to pitch next week. Once funding secured. I would have told you. I almost laughed. You would have told me after the fact, I asked. It was going to benefit the family. Under whose ownership? I asked quietly. He hesitated. That hesitation said everything. Nicole needed to be the face initially, he said. It's easier with her background. So I was a silent backer, I said. Unaware. Uncredited. You would have come in later. I held his gaze. You used my credit line. You co-signed, he snapped. For household liquidity. I said, not for a hidden LLC. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it this time. I'm on administrative leave, he said suddenly. They suspended me pending review. There it was. The crack in the armor. I'm aware, I replied. They think I redirected client contacts. He continued. They're reviewing my emails. Did you? I asked. He didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough to become an answer. You're destroying my career, he said finally, voice breaking slightly. I didn't send the emails, I said. You did. He pushed his chair back abruptly. This is revenge, he accused. No, I said quietly. This is consequence. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. The color drained from his face. What? I asked. Nicole just sent a group message, he muttered. She says I misled her. She's threatening to disclose private investor communications. I didn't react. She says you told her I supported the venture, I said calmly. He looked up. You knew. I read her email, I said. I forwarded it to my attorney. You're involving lawyers in everything, he said. You involved my finances in everything. For a moment. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Upstairs. Our son's laughter drifted faintly down the hallway. Joshua's eyes flicked toward the sound. We can fix this, he said. Softer now. Privately. How? I asked. I'll shut it down, he said. The LLC. The startup. Everything. Too late. I replied. His face hardened again. So what? You're going to divorce me over one mistake. One, I repeated. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the chair. I need air, he muttered. He walked toward the door, then paused. I'm taking the car, he said. Which one? I asked. The Mercedes. I almost smiled. Go ahead, I said. He didn't understand the weight of that permission. He left without another word. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. Attempted withdrawal denied. He had tried to access a secondary account. The notification included the location. The driveway. I closed my laptop and walked to the front window. The Mercedes was still parked outside. Joshua was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at his phone. He didn't drive away. He just sat there. I knew that look. It wasn't rage. It wasn't shame. It was realization. He had believed the affair was the greatest risk he took. He still didn't understand that the real collapse had nothing to do with the garage. It was the paper trail. And I had every page. The driveway was empty when I woke up. The Mercedes was gone. For a brief second, I wondered if Joshua had finally decided to disappear entirely. Then I checked the security app. The car had left at 6:14 in the morning. I made breakfast for my son like nothing had shifted. Toast, scrambled eggs, a banana sliced into careful circles. He chattered about dinosaurs and a class project while I nodded and smiled. Routine is a powerful disguise. After I dropped him at school, I drove straight home and went upstairs to my office. The house felt hollow without Joshua's pacing, without the tension hovering in the air. I opened the financial dashboard first. There it was. An attempted withdrawal from a secondary account tied to my consulting firm. Denied. Timestamp. 6:21 a.m. Location tag. Mobile device. He had tried again. I pulled up the IP trace connected to the login attempt. It didn't match our home network. It matched the same shared workspace downtown listed under Nicole's LLC. My jaw tightened. He hadn't gone to clear his head. He had gone to regroup. I took screenshots of everything. Timestamps. IP addresses. Declined transaction alerts. Then I opened the state registry database again and double-checked the LLC filing. 2 managing members now listed: Nicole Harris, Joshua Bennett. Updated yesterday. He had amended the filing after the compliance inquiry began. I leaned back slowly in my chair. That wasn't panic. That was adaptation. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. He's attempting additional transfers, I said without preamble. And he amended the LLC registration. Document everything, she replied. We can pursue a temporary financial restraining order. I also suspect intellectual property misuse. I added, their pitch deck includes language pulled from my proprietary materials. Do you have proof? She asked. I have timestamps and archived versions. Good, she said. Send it. The stronger the paper trail, the stronger your position. When we ended the call, my inbox chimed again, this time from Joshua's employer. Formal notice. Expanded internal audit. The subject line was almost clinical. They were now reviewing client communication logs for possible conflict of interest. I opened the email attachment. They were requesting clarification regarding potential redirection of company clients to an external venture. He hadn't just built something behind my back. He had used his company's network as leverage. Another email followed. This one from Nicole. We need to talk. This is spiraling. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the pitch deck link I had accessed earlier through a cached browser path. The slide titles felt familiar. Market realignment strategy. Performance optimization framework. Revenue acceleration model. Those weren't generic phrases. They were mine. Not verbatim, but structured the same way. I opened my archived consulting presentation from last quarter and placed it side by side. Bullet points mirrored. Flow mirrored. Even the sequencing of the problem-solution narrative. He hadn't just used my credit. He had used my intellectual architecture. My phone buzzed again. Tiffany. I let it ring twice before answering. Anna, she said, voice shaky. What is going on? Joshua said investors pulled out. They did, I replied calmly. He said you froze everything. I froze access to my credit line. I corrected. There was silence on her end. He told me it was secured. She whispered. How much did you loan him? I asked again. A significant portion of my retirement, she admitted quietly. Did you co-sign anything? Yes. Under whose name? There was a pause. Nicole's, she said finally. I closed my eyes briefly. He told me it was just paperwork. She added defensively, Did you read it? I asked. I trusted him, she snapped. So had I. He asked me to keep it quiet from you, she continued, voice breaking slightly. He said you'd overreact. I see, I said. When we hung up, I forwarded her admission in a summary email to my attorney. Every conversation was now documentation. Mid-afternoon. Another message appeared in my inbox. From a senior executive at Joshua's company. Request for meeting, external conflict review. They wanted to speak with me directly. That was faster than I expected. I replied with availability for the following morning. My phone vibrated again. A text from Joshua. Why are you talking to my company? Because your company deserves to know. I typed it and deleted it. Instead, I responded, we'll discuss it through attorneys. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. Investor withdrawal confirmation, Nicole Harris, LLC. Attached was a short note from one of the investors. Due to emerging concerns regarding funding transparency and compliance risk, we are rescinding our preliminary commitment. I read it twice. Funding transparency. Compliance risk. Professional language for distrust. Late afternoon light stretched across my office floor as I reviewed one final detail. The LLC's projected revenue chart included client names. Not generic ones. Actual companies. 2 of them were current consulting clients of mine. My stomach tightened. He had included my client pipeline in his projections. Without my consent. Without disclosure. That crossed a line even he might not fully comprehend. I drafted a cease and desist letter with my attorney's template open beside me. Unauthorized use of proprietary frameworks. Unauthorized representation of professional affiliation. Misuse of shared marital assets. I scheduled it for delivery the following morning to both Joshua and Nicole, simultaneously. When evening came, I walked downstairs and paused in the hallway. Our wedding photo still hung near the staircase. We looked younger in it. Certain, I reached up and removed it from the wall. I didn't smash it. I didn't cry. I simply set it face down on the console table. Outside, the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the driveway. The Mercedes pulled in quietly. Joshua stepped out slowly, shoulders tense. He looked up at the house like he wasn't sure it was still his. Maybe it wasn't. I turned away from the window and headed back to my office. They had tried to build something behind my back. Now it was my turn to dismantle it legally. The delivery confirmations arrived at 8:12 in the morning. Cease and desist letters had been signed for, one at the shared workspace downtown, the other at Joshua's temporary office address. I stared at the digital receipts longer than necessary. There is something final about documentation that can't be denied. Joshua didn't call immediately. That surprised me. Instead, my phone buzzed with an email from his company's executive office requesting an in-person meeting. They wanted clarification regarding my documentation. I agreed without hesitation. The corporate headquarters downtown had always impressed Joshua. Glass walls, polished floors, the kind of place that made him stand taller when he walked in. This time, I walked in alone. The senior executive who greeted me was calm, controlled, professional. Thank you for coming. Ms. Bennett, he said. Anna is fine, I replied. We sat in a conference room overlooking the city. He opened a folder already thick with printed emails. We've uncovered additional irregularities, he said. It appears Mr. Bennett contacted 2 corporate clients from his company email to discuss an external opportunity. I didn't react outwardly. That opportunity being Nicole's LLC, he continued. Yes, I said. He slid a printed email across the table. Joshua had forwarded proprietary client contacts to Nicole. Time-stamped. Clear. Is this the first complaint? I asked quietly. The executive hesitated. No, he admitted. There was a minor ethics concern last year regarding expense allocations. It was resolved internally. Resolved. Until now. He's currently on administrative suspension. The executive said. Depending on the outcome of the audit, termination is possible. I nodded once. I'm not here to damage your company, I said calmly. I'm here to protect my assets and my professional reputation. He studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting anger. Instead, I gave him documentation, LLC filings, transfer attempts, pitch deck screenshots referencing my consulting frameworks. He exhaled slowly. "This escalates things significantly," he said. "I'm aware," I replied. When I left the building, my phone buzzed again. "Nicole." Her message was longer this time. "This has gone too far. Investors are asking about compliance investigations. My certification board contacted me. I didn't know he used your materials." I read it twice. She was distancing herself. I forwarded the message to my attorney without responding. By noon, industry gossip blogs had begun circulating vague posts about a failed wellness startup linked to corporate misconduct. No names yet. But the circles were small. Someone would connect them soon. My phone rang again. "Tiffany." I answered. "Anna," she said, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Can we meet?" We chose a quiet cafe near her home. She looked older somehow, her posture less rigid than usual. "He told me you were overreacting," she said, staring at her untouched coffee. "But I saw the letter. You signed documents," I said gently. "You deserve to know what they contained." She nodded slowly. "He said it was for the family," she whispered. "He also told Nicole I supported it," I replied. Her eyes widened slightly. "He did. Yes." She closed her eyes briefly. "He asked me to hide paperwork," she admitted. "I didn't think it was wrong. I thought you two just had communication issues." "It wasn't communication," I said. "It was concealment." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "These are copies," she said quietly. I kept them. Inside were draft projections and an early investor summary. I scanned them quickly. Projected revenue based on client names I recognized. My clients, without consent. "I'm sorry," Tiffany said, voice breaking. I should have asked more questions. I folded the papers carefully. "It's not about blame," I said. "It's about accountability." When I returned home, Joshua was waiting in the living room. His posture had changed. Less aggressive. More cornered. "They're reviewing everything," he said. "I know. They found emails." "I know. They're considering termination." I held his gaze. "They should," I said quietly. He flinched at that. "You're enjoying this?" he accused weakly. "No," I replied. "I'm stabilizing it." He shook his head. "Nicole's certification board suspended her pending investigation," he added. "Her website is down. Investors are gone. And," I asked, "and she's blaming me," he snapped. "Did she have reason?" I asked calmly. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence filled the room. "I never meant for it to spiral like this," he said finally. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never thought beyond the first step." His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and swore under his breath. "They've scheduled a disciplinary hearing," he said. "Formal. With legal." I nodded. "I'll be there," I said. He stared at me. "They invited you?" "Yes." For the first time since the garage, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or defiance. It was comprehension. This wasn't just a marital conflict. This was structural collapse. That evening, after he went upstairs without another word, I stood alone in my office looking out at the city skyline. The affair had been humiliating. The financial deception had been infuriating. But what truly ended us wasn't emotion. It was documentation. The spark had been in my garage. The fire had spread through paper trails. And now, the story was no longer private. It was spreading. The notice arrived at 7:43 in the morning. "Formal disciplinary hearing. Attendance required." Joshua read it twice before setting his phone down slowly on the kitchen counter. He didn't look at me at first. "They want you there," he said finally. "I know," I replied. He stared at the marble surface like it might offer an alternative outcome. "This is excessive," he muttered. "It's personal." "No," I said quietly. "It's corporate." The hearing was scheduled for 10:30 at headquarters. I reviewed the documentation again with my attorney before leaving. Every file organized chronologically. LLC registration. Amended filings. transfer attempts, compliance emails, investor communications, pitch deck screenshots. It wasn't emotion driving this. It was sequence. The conference room was larger than I expected. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking downtown Chicago. 4 executives seated along one side of the table, legal counsel beside them. Joshua sat alone at the opposite end. He looked tired. Nicole was not present. The compliance officer began with a timeline. Mr. Bennett, records indicate you initiated contact with corporate clients regarding an external venture on multiple occasions. Joshua's voice was controlled but strained. It was exploratory. Exploratory communications using company resources. The officer clarified. A printed email was projected onto the screen. Joshua forwarding client information to Nicole. Subject line. Strategic alignment. My name appeared in one of the attachments. My professional portfolio referenced indirectly. I didn't move. Ms. Bennett, the legal counsel said. Turning to me, can you confirm ownership of the consulting materials referenced in this presentation? Yes, I said evenly. They are proprietary frameworks developed by my firm. And did you authorize their use in this venture? No. Silence settled heavily. Joshua's jaw tightened. It wasn't theft, he said. It was collaboration. Without disclosure. The executive asked. He didn't answer. Another slide appeared. Projected revenue chart including 2 of my active clients. The executive leaned forward slightly. Were these clients informed they were being represented as part of a startup pitch? Joshua swallowed. No. The compliance officer glanced down at his notes. There is also the matter of shared marital assets being leveraged without transparent disclosure. Joshua's head snapped toward me. You went after my marriage too, he demanded under his breath. I protected my business, I replied calmly. The legal counsel spoke next. We are evaluating potential fiduciary breaches, misuse of company resources, and reputational risk exposure. Joshua's composure began to fracture. This is disproportionate, he said. It was early stage. Nothing finalized. An attempted transfer of funds from a shared credit line was flagged at 12:37 a.m. last Tuesday. The compliance officer said, Do you dispute that? Joshua looked at me again. He didn't speak. The room felt colder. After an hour of questioning, the senior executive closed his folder. Pending final review, Mr. Bennett, you remain on suspension, he said. Termination is under consideration. Joshua nodded stiffly. When we stepped into the hallway afterward, he turned to me. You could have handled this privately, he said. You tried to handle everything privately, I replied. That's how we got here. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and cursed quietly. What now? I asked. Nicole, he said. Her certification board suspended her. They're reviewing her credentials. I absorbed that without visible reaction. They contacted investors, he continued. The startup site is offline. He leaned against the wall, suddenly looking unsteady. I didn't think it would escalate like this, he admitted. You built it on concealment, I said. Escalation was inevitable. We rode the elevator down in silence. Outside, the wind cut sharply between buildings. Tiffany was waiting near the entrance. Her presence startled me. She approached slowly, eyes red. Joshua, she said softly. He looked embarrassed. I just came from the lawyer, she said quietly. They told me the loan documents place liability entirely on you. He closed his eyes briefly. You didn't read them, she asked. I thought it was temporary, he muttered. She looked at me then. I was wrong about you, she said. I held her gaze but said nothing. On the drive home, Joshua stared out the window. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't get out immediately. They're going to fire me, he said flatly. Probably, I replied. And you're fine with that. I'm fine with accountability, I said. He finally stepped out of the car. That evening, a formal email arrived. Immediate suspension extended pending termination review. Nicole's LLC website displayed a single message. Temporarily unavailable. I closed my laptop and walked into the living room. Joshua was sitting on the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "You didn't mean to get caught," I corrected. He didn't argue. Upstairs, our son laughed at something on television. Joshua looked toward the sound. "I just wanted more," he said. "You wanted leverage," I replied. He exhaled slowly. I went upstairs to my office and retrieved a folder. When I returned, I placed it on the coffee table in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. "Preliminary divorce documentation," I said calmly. He stared at it without touching it. "You're serious?" he whispered. "Yes." He opened the folder slowly. The pages reflected back at him in black and white. He had believed the garage was the moment everything went wrong. He was wrong. The garage was just the beginning. The hearing was the confirmation. And the folder on the table was the consequence. Joshua stared at the divorce folder as if it might disappear if he blinked hard enough. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He flipped the first page carefully, like the paper itself might cut him. "You're actually doing this," he said. "Yes," I replied. He turned another page. Temporary custody proposal. Asset division summary. Prenuptial enforcement clause highlighted in clean, undeniable text. He stopped there. "You always loved that prenup," he muttered. "No," I said calmly. "I respected it." He exhaled sharply. "You're using it as a weapon. I'm using it as it was written." He leaned back against the couch, eyes scanning the clause he once mocked. In the event of fiduciary misconduct or undisclosed financial ventures resulting in reputational or economic harm, primary business assets remain protected. "You're claiming fiduciary misconduct?" he asked. "You attempted to transfer shared funds into an undisclosed LLC. I said, you used proprietary materials without consent. That qualifies." His jaw tightened. "It was an investment. It was concealment," I corrected. He flipped to the next section. The townhouse deed listed solely under my name. The Mercedes registration under my name. My consulting firm structured as a separate legal entity. "You planned this," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You triggered it." He closed the folder halfway and looked at me. "And what about our son?" he asked. "He deserves stability," I said. "I'm his father. And you will remain his father," I said evenly. "But you're currently suspended from work and under investigation. That affects custody evaluation." He flinched at the word custody. "You're going to argue I'm unfit?" he asked. "I'm going to argue he needs consistency," I replied. "Same home, same school, same schedule." He rubbed his temples. "You're framing this like I committed a crime." "You committed deception," I said quietly. "Repeatedly." His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He ignored it. "You're trying to destroy me," he said. "I'm protecting myself," I corrected. He leaned forward suddenly. "I can claim emotional distress," he said. "You froze funds. You contacted my company. You escalated everything. You attempted to move money while sitting in my car with another woman," I said. "Documentation predates the freeze." He fell silent. The silence stretched long and heavy. "Nicole retained legal counsel," he said finally. "I expected that," I replied. "She says you're defaming her." "I have timestamps," I said calmly. "And archived records?" He looked at me as if searching for the woman he married. "She was just business," he insisted weakly. "She was leverage," I said. His shoulders sagged. Tiffany called later that evening. "Can we all meet?" she asked. "Privately, before this becomes public." "It already is public," I replied. "Please," she said. "For the family." I agreed to a mediation meeting with legal representation. We met 2 days later at a neutral office downtown. Joshua arrived first. Tiffany sat beside him. Smaller than usual, her posture subdued. My attorney sat calmly at my side. The mediator began outlining procedural expectations. Joshua interrupted. "Can't we handle this without turning it into a war?" My attorney answered before I did. "This isn't war. It's settlement." Joshua looked at Tiffany as if expecting her to support him. She avoided his eyes. The mediator shifted to asset discussion. "Townhouse ownership is solely under Ms. Bennett." She confirmed. Joshua looked startled. You thought wrong," I said quietly. "The vehicle," the mediator continued, "registered to me." I replied, "And the startup liabilities?" Joshua's face hardened. "Those are separate?" "Yes," my attorney said. "Under his name." The mediator reviewed financial disclosures. Suspended income. Frozen bonus. Outstanding startup debt tied to the LLC. Joshua stared at the numbers. "You're going to leave me with nothing," he said. "You built the debt," I replied. Tiffany finally spoke. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought it was secured." Joshua didn't respond. The mediator turned to custody terms. Primary physical custody to me. Structured visitation for Joshua. No spousal support due to documented misconduct under prenup enforcement. Joshua looked up sharply. "You're not asking for alimony," he said. "No," I replied. "Why?" "Because I don't need it." The simplicity of that seemed to hit him harder than anything else. The meeting ended without reconciliation. As we stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, Joshua paused. "You never gave us a chance to fix this," he said. "I gave you months," I replied. He looked down at his hands. "I didn't think it would unravel this fast." "It didn't," I said quietly. "It unraveled slowly. You just ignored the threads." That night, he packed a suitcase. Our son stood in the hallway watching. "Where's Daddy going?" he asked. "Daddy has to stay somewhere else for a while," I said gently. Joshua crouched down and hugged him tightly. "I love you, buddy," he said. "I know," our son replied innocently. When Joshua stood up, he hesitated at the door. "This didn't have to end like this," he said. "Yes," I replied softly. "It did." He walked out into the cold. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. He believed he had lost his marriage. He still didn't understand what he had truly forfeited. The termination email arrived before 9. Joshua forwarded it to me without a message. Effective immediately. Employment terminated due to ethical misconduct and fiduciary breach. No severance. Bonus compensation forfeited. Access revoked. I read it once, then closed my laptop. It felt quieter than I expected. No shouting. No celebration. Just a quiet shift in gravity. Joshua came by that afternoon to collect more of his belongings. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "They let me go," he said unnecessarily. "I know," I replied. He walked through the living room slowly, as if memorizing it. "You're satisfied now?" he asked without looking at me. "I'm resolved," I said. He turned toward me. "That's cold." "No," I said. "It's clear." He picked up a framed photo from the shelf and hesitated. "I didn't think it would cost me everything," he admitted. "It didn't cost you everything," I said. "You still have your son," he swallowed. "And I have my name," I replied. He nodded slowly and carried the box toward the door. My phone buzzed as he stepped outside. An email from my attorney. Nicole's legal counsel had issued a formal response disputing intellectual property misuse. I opened the attachment. It was structured, defensive, full of language about co-development and misinterpretation. I forwarded it back to my attorney with 3 simple words. "See attached timestamps." Minutes later, she replied. "We have stronger documentation. They will struggle to dispute." I closed the thread. Later that evening, another notification appeared. Nicole's certification board had issued a temporary suspension pending investigation. Public statement forthcoming. The startup website had been replaced with a blank page. I stared at it for a moment. This was the part people imagine when they think of revenge. Public fallout. Professional collapse. But it didn't feel triumphant. It felt inevitable. The next morning, an industry blog published a short piece. Unnamed regional sales manager under investigation for ethics violations linked to external venture. No names yet? But those who knew would connect them. A former client emailed me directly. I've heard rumors. Are you affected? I replied carefully. My business remains stable and independent. That was all that needed to be said. Tiffany came by that afternoon. She stood awkwardly near the doorway. Hands clasped. I'm sorry, she said without preamble. For what? I asked. For doubting you, she replied. For believing his version. I nodded once. He blames me, she admitted. Says I pressured him to aim higher. He made his choices, I said quietly. She looked around the house. You're really going through with this? Yes, she sighed. I thought ambition was strength, she said. I didn't see the arrogance. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to debate. Later that week, the court date for the preliminary divorce hearing was scheduled. My attorney sent over the official filing confirmation. Public record. Joshua's name entered into the system. There is something permanent about court documentation. It doesn't fade like memory. It sits there, indexed, archived. Joshua called that night. They're reviewing my professional license, he said flatly. I know, I replied. They're saying my conduct reflects on the industry. It does, I said. There was a long silence. I never thought you'd take it this far, he said. I didn't take it anywhere, I replied. You walked it there. He exhaled slowly. I lost the job, he said. Nicole's venture is dissolved. Investors want repayment. I waited. I'm in debt, he admitted. I didn't gloat. I didn't soften. I simply listened. You could help, he said finally. With what? I asked. With some of the financial fallout. You leveraged my credit without permission, I said evenly. You attached my reputation to a venture I never approved. He didn't respond. I'm not responsible for debt I didn't create. I continued. His voice dropped. I thought we were a team. We were, I said, until you decided otherwise. When the call ended, I sat alone in my office. For the first time since the garage, doubt brushed against me. Had I escalated too quickly? Had there been another path? Then I remembered the breathing in the dark. The transfer attempt at 12:37 a.m. The amended LLC filing. The client names in the pitch deck. This wasn't impulsive. It was patterned. Downstairs, my son was building something with plastic blocks. He looked up when I entered the room. Mom, look, he said proudly. It's strong. I knelt beside him and examined the structure. Carefully stacked. Balanced. Stable. That's really strong, I said. He smiled and added another block. Later that night, I stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The scandal wasn't loud anymore. It had settled into permanence. Joshua had believed ambition justified secrecy. He had believed leverage excused deception. He had believed I would stay silent. Instead, everything was now part of public record. The affair had humiliated me. The fraud had ended him. And the silence I kept in the garage had become the loudest decision of all. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected. Not physically small, but contained, like the walls themselves were absorbing every whispered word, every shuffled document, every controlled breath. Joshua stood at the opposite table beside his attorney. He looked thinner than he had a month ago, less polished, more exposed. I sat beside my counsel, hands folded calmly on the table. The judge reviewed the filings without expression. Petitioner cites fiduciary misconduct and financial concealment, she said. Flipping through pages, respondent does not dispute the existence of the external venture. Joshua's attorney cleared his throat. My client acknowledges poor judgment, but disputes the characterization of malicious intent. Poor judgment? I almost smiled. Intent becomes irrelevant when consequences are documented. The judge turned toward me. Miss Bennett, are you seeking spousal support? No, Your Honor. Joshua's head tilted slightly at that. And primary physical custody of the minor child. Yes. Respondent agrees to structured visitation. Joshua hesitated only a second. Yes. The judge nodded slowly. Given the documented financial irregularities and the prenuptial agreement provisions, the court recognizes the protection of the petitioner's separate business assets. Joshua closed his eyes briefly. It was subtle, but I saw it. Recognition, the judge continued. Temporary orders will reflect primary residence with the petitioner. Financial liabilities connected to the external LLC remain with the respondent. A gavel tap. Not dramatic. Not loud. But definitive. When we stepped into the hallway afterward, reporters weren't waiting. There were no cameras. Just fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps. Joshua stopped walking. That's it? He asked quietly. That's it, I replied. He stared at the floor. I thought you'd ask for more, he said. I didn't need more. You could have destroyed me completely. I didn't have to, I said. He looked up at me then. I destroyed myself, he admitted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shouted. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Nicole wasn't there. Her certification board had issued a formal suspension the week before. Her public statement cited professional recalibration. Investors had filed civil claims for misrepresentation. The startup existed now only as paperwork in a dissolution filing. Outside the courthouse, Tiffany stood near the entrance. She looked uncertain, almost fragile. Is it done? She asked. Yes, I said. She glanced at Joshua. He avoided her eyes. I thought success meant pushing harder, she said softly. I didn't see the cracks. Cracks don't appear overnight, I replied. Joshua finally spoke. I should have told you, he said to her. You should have told her, Tiffany corrected gently, nodding toward me. Silence settled between us. There were no more accusations left, only outcomes. Joshua approached me one last time before walking away. I never hated you, he said. I know, I replied. I was jealous, he admitted. That surprised me. Of what? I asked. Your control, he said. Your independence. I felt smaller. I studied his face carefully. That wasn't my fault, I said. No, he agreed. It wasn't. He picked up his coat and stepped away, shoulders slightly bowed. Not defeated. Just stripped of illusion. Weeks passed quietly after the ruling. The townhouse felt different without tension humming in the walls. I rearranged the living room, removed the last wedding photo, repainted my office. Subtle changes. Intentional. My consulting firm gained 2 new clients during that time. Word travels quickly in corporate circles. Crisis management expert navigates personal scandal with strategic precision. They didn't say it out loud, but they noticed. One afternoon, while reviewing a new contract, my phone buzzed. Joshua. I let it ring once before answering. I found a smaller place, he said. That's good, I replied. It's not far, he added. For visitation. I appreciate that. There was a pause. I got an offer, he continued. Different state. Lower position. Are you taking it? I don't know. You should decide based on stability, I said. Not pride. He exhaled softly. You always think long-term? Yes, I said. That's what I lacked. Perhaps he lacked patience. That night, after putting my son to bed, I stood alone in the garage. The Mercedes sat quietly in its space, polished, unbothered. The night in the garage felt distant now, not because it mattered less, but because it had already served its purpose. I had thought revenge would feel sharp. Instead, it felt like alignment. Joshua had believed control meant secrecy. He had believed ambition excused betrayal. But control, real control, comes from structure, from documentation. from knowing exactly where the lines are drawn. The affair was the spark. The deception was the fuel. But the ending was built on something quieter. Boundaries. As I turned off the garage light, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just clarity. And clarity is far more permanent than rage. 1 year later, the house felt lighter. Not bigger. Not quieter. Just lighter. The townhouse was no longer filled with tension disguised as routine. It was structured around intention now. Morning breakfasts without forced smiles. Evenings without the low hum of resentment behind closed doors. My consulting firm had doubled its client base. 2 regional companies had hired me specifically for crisis restructuring. One of them admitted openly, "We watched how you handled your own situation." I didn't ask which part they meant. The legal filings had settled into archives. The LLC had been dissolved officially 6 months earlier. Joshua had relocated to another state for a mid-level position at a smaller company. Stable. But far from the trajectory he once imagined. We coordinated visitation schedules with professional politeness. Nothing more. Nicole's professional suspension remained on record. She resurfaced quietly under a different brand name months later. But the original scandal followed her like a watermark. Reputation doesn't erase. It adjusts. One afternoon, while reviewing a contract in my office, I paused and looked at the framed certifications on my wall. I hadn't added new awards. I had added boundaries. My son ran down the hallway, laughing about a school project. "Mom, look," he said, holding up a paper model of a bridge. "It has to balance on both sides," he explained seriously. I crouched down beside him. "And what happens if one side is weaker?" I asked. "It falls," he said simply. "Balance." It sounds so simple when you're 5 years old. Later that evening, Joshua called. He sounded different. Not defensive. Not resentful. Measured. "I got promoted," he said quietly. "Congratulations," I replied. "It's smaller than before," he added. "But stable." "That's good." There was a pause. "I've been thinking," he said. "I used to blame you." "For what?" "For being ahead," he admitted. "For being secure when I wasn't. That insecurity wasn't my responsibility," I said gently. "I know that now," he replied. Silence stretched between us. But it wasn't heavy. It was neutral. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. Just 2 words. "I accept that," I replied. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it simply means release. After we hung up, I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city lights. Chicago's skyline shimmered in the distance, indifferent to personal collapse and private victory. The night in the garage felt like another lifetime. I remembered the breathing in the dark, the choice not to scream, the decision to lock the doors. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own story. People often assume revenge is explosive, but the most powerful form of revenge is restraint, documentation, patience, letting consequences unfold without shouting over them. I didn't ruin Joshua's life. I exposed the structure he built on concealment. And when concealment collapses, everything built on top of it follows. The real turning point wasn't the garage. It wasn't the hearing. It wasn't the courtroom. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to destroy him to survive. I only needed to protect myself. A week later, I moved to a quieter neighborhood closer to my son's school. Same city. Different energy. The Mercedes still sat in the driveway, not as a symbol of betrayal, but as a reminder of leverage used correctly on the anniversary of the divorce ruling. I sat at my desk and reviewed the year. Revenue up. Legal disputes closed. Personal stability restored. No dramatic music. No confetti. Just peace. And peace feels louder than chaos once you've lived through both. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Betrayal isn't the end of power. Silence can be strategy. Boundaries can be protection. And dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't ask for applause. If you've ever stood in your own version of that garage, hearing something break inside you while everything outside looks intact, remember this. You don't have to scream to win. Sometimes you just have to hold the key. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. There are more stories about control, consequence, and quiet strength coming. Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you believe in stories where dignity wins without theatrics, subscribe and stay close. Because sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one holding the most power. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.